Sport in itself is kind of a demarcation of a almost sacred space where individuals can go into that is separate from the outside things we have to do and everything. There's a very kind of special place where you can play. It's a place of play. And it's a place, play along with play goes self-expression. Young kids know this very well. They carve out some little area and they play very seriously. So no, it's not that play's not serious, but it's creative. And I think that's what sport and football can be. It's its own space.
Welcome to the Coachcraft podcast, where we explore the art of coaching youth sports with exceptional coaches. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the philosophies, experiences, stories, and insights of coaches who are making a difference in their communities and beyond. In these interviews, we take our time because the way to get under the surface and beyond the banal is to examine the lived experiences of guests through relaxed and invitational conversation. I'm your host, Alf Gracombe, and whether you're a coach, an aspiring coach, parent, or someone passionate about youth development, I hope Coachcraft will inspire you to learn from these coaches and improve your craft as a coach and a leader in your youth sports communities. Today's guest is Mike Smith. Born and raised in England, Mike developed a deep love for sports from an early age, playing everything from football and rugby to cricket and tennis. This early passion laid the foundation for what would become a global career in youth sports development, spanning 3 decades and multiple continents, taking him from Harvard University to the Portuguese soccer leagues in Massachusetts to ultimately serve as the CEO of Special Olympics Europe. For the past decade, he has served as a network development director for Coerver Coaching, recognized as one of the world's leading soccer skills teaching methodologies, where he has helped shape youth development programs across 50 countries. Now, based in the football mecca that is Barcelona, Mike continues to innovate through his company Big Idea Sports, focusing on human-centered technology for player and coach development. Throughout his career, Mike has maintained one consistent mission: helping young people not only learn and love sports, but develop the skills and confidence to express their unique personalities both on and off the field. It's with great pleasure that I welcome Mike Smith for this thoroughly wide-ranging and fascinating conversation to the Coachcraft podcast. Hey, Mike Smith, welcome to the Coachcraft podcast. Great to have you.
Pleasure to be here, Al. Thanks very much for the invite.
All right. Good. Well, let's get started. So, Mike, I like to start these conversations to learn a little bit about you as a person and the beginning stage of your journey in the world of football, the world of sports. So take us back, if you can, to the early days when you first started playing as a boy.
Yeah. Well, it goes a long way back. I was sports mad, I think, from the age of 3. So I was born in England, but we moved to the States for 3 years. And so I would say that's my first sports experience was in the States. Baseball was big. Back of our house, big baseball diamond. We used to go, just the kids who would walk down and pick up games or whatever. And I was 4, so I wasn't going to let, size or age put me off. I remember my mitt was as big as my, half the size of my body kind of thing. But it was that informal introduction to sport. Sport was big in the US, obviously, kids played. But it was all informal. But I took to it very fast and just loved to play, loved the environment, loved everything about it. So then we moved back to England. So we came back there just in time for 1966, which
what happened in 1966?
Well, a lot of people ask that. Yeah. England won a World Cup. Sure about this? As they Google it. No, so we're there in 1966. Living in Dorchester on the south coast of England. I think that was my first experience of the scale and the scope and the depth and the emotion of football. I think it was still in black and white in those days, but it was something special. And the build up to the final, as a kid, it was an emotional thing. And of course, it's your country, being represented. But even then, it was, all the players, they had iconic players. So you learned about iconic players, like Bobby Moore and the Charlton brothers and Jeff Hurst. And then in Germany, they had Franz Beckenbauer, the Kaiser. I mean,
Right.
it doesn't get bigger than that. You're playing against the Kaiser.
Yeah, and this is only 20, a little bit more than 20 years beyond past World War II.
Yes. So England, Germany had its connotations.
Sure.
And the Kaiser kind of, and so yeah, it was just one of those games that England won on, playing really well, and then a couple of fortunate moments.
There was
where one particular where, still being debated, did the ball go over the line as it hit the bar and came down? We didn't have VAR. Thank God we had football without VAR. And so there you go. England won 4-2. It's interesting. I was saying the other day, the crossbar, the famous crossbar of 1966, which was essentially the winning goal, is now on display in the Museum of Football.
In the British Museum or something.
Yes, so this is, as important as the mummies from Egypt.
Right next to the Elgin marbles, right?
But that I think it was that impact, and to this day, that's how kids pick up the start of their real love of the game. If you're a sporting type, if it's somehow in your body and mind to be sporting,
Yeah, and do you remember, you were a relatively young boy, 1966, but your memories are fairly vivid, it sounds like, of living through that.
It was, and it's interesting, in those days, in England, there wasn't a lot of club sport for under 12s. So we didn't have a club team. You played a little bit in the school, maybe, but you had to go out and find it, So that's what we did. We went out and found the game, down in the local park, or stealing off to another town with 5 boys because we've been invited to a game and your parents didn't know about it, this kind of thing.
And so there was no organized...
Yeah, it was that pursuing the game, I think, because it just is something I just love to do,
At a certain point, you must have played some organized football.
I wanted to get organized.
Do you remember when that was and what that looked like?
I think that was, we moved from the South Coast up to the Midlands, to Leicester City, and that was sort of junior high, so 12, 13, 13 years old. They had a school team, a pretty good school team, and that's when it started, where you actually have a coach, go on a team, play other schools in a league, trying to qualify for the championship, and so it started there. And then after that, you join a club team when you're 13, 14. I was playing on an adult team when I was 16, and so I just kind of went with it. But along the way, I played, soccer was kind of my game, but I played rugby, cricket, hockey, basically anything with a ball, golf.
Mm-hmm.
Was just somehow that environment appealed to me and fed something. So, yeah.
So, this is, I guess we're probably around, 1970 now, let's say, just to put it in an era. It's after the World Cup victory by England. The country, no doubt, has its shoulders back and chest out in terms of its football identity. But do you remember, as you joined, these school teams, these organized teams, do you have any recollection of what the training was like, what the coaching was like, what kind of instruction you were getting?
It was a different era. So I'd say there wasn't much, to be honest. There wasn't much coaching. There was a coach. I think it's more around physical. We did a lot of running and then playing. I think the coach's job was more picking the team, who plays where.
Yeah, just put them in a 4-4-2 and just...
Yes, and I think we talked a fair bit about formations and things like that. But I think there was very little technical training. Throughout, when I was growing up, we didn't have technical coaches. We didn't have people who work on our skills, but we played a lot. We played a lot of games. When I was 15, 16, I played 3 games a week, competitive, Yeah, and I think that's how I developed anyway. But I would say I didn't have a lot of influence from a coach, but I think that catches up with you at some point. If you go up the levels, from high school to college team or to a professional team or semi-pro team professional, then you have a lot of intuitive way to play, but you don't necessarily have that grounding in the core skills that you need to play at the highest level. So I think it caught up.
Yeah.
But it didn't really stop my love of the game, from when I was a kid.
And then you must have realized, or somebody must have realized, that you were a pretty good player. And because you did then come to the U.S. for college, and you
Yes.
played in college as well. So I'd love to kind of hear how that story developed and how you sought out that opportunity, or how it came to you, and then what you did here in the U.S. back in the U.S. for a second
to
time.
go from England then to the US. So, but I had a good football soccer CV, if you like. I think it was handwritten actually, and so we had just a personal contact who knew some people around Massachusetts, and they knew people at Harvard, and I was very lucky there that there was an Irish man, Seamus Mallin. Seamus went on to be a TV commentator in the early days of soccer in the US, in the professional game. Brilliant guy. And I think it was just at the time they were just, besides the academic, I was okay, they were looking to improve their team, and they get a CV from England and it looked very good, and I tried out for the national schools team and all this kind of stuff. So so that got me to Harvard, and which was a great experience. It's very different, playing on a college team, which is a very American thing. College sport is a big deal in the US. In England, it's not, with the universities, particularly unless the boat race, Oxford against Cambridge, that's the one thing. But in general, it's not. And that's that you get involved in that, and it's a different thing. So you're kind of, for the first time, representing something quite tangible. This place where you're at school, the people the people who come to see the game, didn't really have that experience so much in England. And I think that was the start of when you identify with a team, is that step. And that deepens your responsibility, but also I think your game gets richer because you have to put in that extra piece into every time you get on the field.
So a little bit about your team at Harvard then. Who were the other players on the team? Are there a lot of internationals? Were there a lot of Americans?
Yeah,
a mix.
I think the first time that when I arrived as a freshman was their effort to bring in more international players. And I think there was one before. In our freshman year, there were 5 international players as freshmen playing on the first team, which was unheard of. Yeah. And we had a really good season. So they built on that. But I think that was when, I think maybe the Harvard outlook of making teams more important, not just as a adjunct to academics, sort of started to take over, and the international part came to pass. So yes, it was a mix, but a good mix. There's some good American players from New Jersey, Midwest, Texas, whatever. We're some good players.
Yeah, well, the game was certainly growing, at that time. This would have been, early 80s?
Yeah, it was, late 70s and then into 81. And then we finished. We had a pretty good year last year, and then you move into the big world.
Yeah. Well, you and, Pele have something in common. You were here playing in North America at the same time, I think, when he was.
Yeah, I remember the Cosmos. Yeah, went down to New York a couple of times, and that was something. The pro game was in its infancy there,
It was the first time I think it was kind of getting a mass market audience. There was the glamour of the Cosmos, of course.
Yes,
but then, I grew up outside of Washington, D.C. We had the Diplomats playing in the North American Soccer League, and, I got to see both Pele and Johan Cruyff play here in the U.S., which was, strange. This was, 40 plus years ago now.
Yeah.
So it's in some ways hard to imagine that, but it was happening for sure.
But soccer had been in the U.S. though for quite a while because of the ethnic influence, from the Italian leagues, the Portuguese leagues. So as you know, in Massachusetts, while I was in university, I was playing with a Portuguese team down in Fall River. That's an amazing experience. I think it still remains one of the best football playing experience I've had, is playing in those kind of leagues, and you get a whole other different side of America.
Yeah, and you're right. That was already here, and I don't need to remind you of the 1950 World Cup when the U.S. beat England.
But
that team was, there weren't I don't think a lot of American born, or there were a lot of second generation, first generation immigrants that made up that team. But we didn't really hear about that. I mean, I wasn't alive in 1950, but that was never even really mentioned as part of our football heritage. I learned about it, much later. It's like, oh, we were in a semifinal of a World Cup in 1950.
Yeah,
But you're right. It was here. It didn't just
it wasn't invented by some corporate America thing to invent. So, but no, the experience that I had in the Portuguese league, it taught me a lot.
This was while you were in college or after?
Yeah,
you were here at Harvard?
Because college was in the fall, so we played in spring. So you could play with other teams in the spring. So I played in the spring with the team, and then when I left college, did a little bit of trying to go on the pro side in the indoor league with Colorado, but it didn't last very long. So I was grounded in the Portuguese for about 12 years in that league. Amazing people, and all the most of them were local players working in local textile factories, and but it taught me, I think, a lot about the community that surrounds a club like that, and how they created a team, the rivalries with all the other towns in the south of Massachusetts, and but that again, that reminded me a bit of England. That is the depth of football. It's in their blood. Yeah, and that was so all those experiences were in the US. Is essentially.
Well, so what? Maybe a little bit more color on the Portuguese league here in Massachusetts, because I don't know much about it. What I do know is in large part been informed by conversations with you. What was it like? You got game days. What was the vibe? What was the scene out at the field?
Yeah, it's pretty vivid. I mean, I can feel it. So the league was very good, well organized. It's called the Luso American Soccer Association, LASA. It was in Fall River, Rhode Island, and those places, and 100% Portuguese. Everybody around is all Portuguese community clubs. And so the standard of football was good, semi-pro level. You get quite a few players coming through, then going on to the growing American league. So these were kind of feeder programs as well. But no, it was more you got the sense of this community, and you're an important part of the community. And so the fans would come out. It's on Sundays. Our games are on Sundays after church. So half the fans would come in all their suits and, everything, and the traditional and, wear, and they're on the sidelines swearing at the referee and everything like this. But then it's the feeling when you play, but then you go back to the clubhouse. The clubhouse is the social center, and the fans are back there, and you have your meal, the long table and whatever, and there's people everywhere. And, whether you won or lost, there's either big commiseration or, or buying you an extra beer or something like that. But it meant a lot. You could feel that it meant a lot to the people in those communities. It was one step above the college thing. It was deeper.
But how did you get linked up with this league? And, you're an Englishman, so.
Yeah.
Were there a lot of other non-Portuguese folks playing in this league?
There were some. There were some members from the Irish community. They would come down and play. Some big Irish players, I remember them. But no, there was a mix. There was a mix, predominantly the Portuguese, but then they were open to finding good players. And I think it's the assistant coach at Harvard is from that area. And so he was the one that there were a couple of us playing on our college team that he would take down. We went down, an hour and 15 minutes to practice every day, and an hour and 15 minutes back. It was a big commitment.
Yeah.
But once you got there, that was the introduction. You feel it. You feel a sense of love from those people. And I was a pretty good player, so I did well for the team. And that's a special place to be in.
I've gotten to know you a little bit over the last couple of years, but I've never asked you, what position did you play?
Yeah,
I'm guessing you were a midfielder, but
I was
my
a
intuition
midfielder,
right?
Both in growing up, more or less. When I got to a men's team, I would take whatever position they give me, which tended to be left back. But that's okay. Did a lot of runs up the. I was before my time doing a lot of runs up the wing, but no. So in colleges is midfield for a while, and then as you get a little bit older, you steadily go back, to centre back, and then I was a sweeper for the last 6-7 years. I was the Kaiser, my Kaiser days from Beckenbauer. But so it was, and then other people were doing the running up and down.
Yeah. Well,
use your experience just to step in at the right moment.
That's right. A familiar trajectory for aging footballers, for sure.
But I enjoyed every bit of it. Yeah.
Well, so you're in this very organized, collegiate sports environment, but also then this more community-oriented football. How would you compare the two? I'm curious, actually, just like
Big
about the
contrast
quality between the two, and yeah.
The difference in quality, hard to say. I would say the Portuguese league, the quality of the overall game is higher because the players have more game experience. They have more tactical experience. They have more nous, if you like. So it's as much figuring out the other team and the tactics, whatever. The college game was was skillful too, but very physical, fast and physical. I think I would characterize it as. Portuguese are naturally skillful people, and they come from a skillful game, the Portuguese game, Benfica, and those kind of clubs.
Yeah.
So I think that was the difference, but both very competitive. But I think the skill level and the speed was faster in the Portuguese league, and there seemed to be more on the line when you walked out on the field. Yeah.
There's I'm not from Massachusetts, but I grew up in the DC area, but I've been in Boston now for about 20 years. And I've seen the remnants, or not, I don't want to say remnants because it's still present very much, but of the Portuguese influence in around this area. Like very few people know, there's a statue at Foxborough of Eusebio, the great Portuguese player.
Yeah.
My son plays club football, and we were out at a game in the more western part of the state in Springfield, and his game was in this stadium. It wasn't a new stadium, and then there was this clubhouse. It was a Portuguese club. And I remember after the game going in there was a snack bar and, kind of this open area with tables. And I was like, oh, yeah, this is, and it had clearly been something that had been there for a while. But I think that's another example of where that kind of community, Portuguese football was present. And then Brazil and Portugal played a friendly, maybe it was about 10 years ago or so at Foxborough. And I went, and wow, what a scene that was. It's like the entire Portuguese and Brazilian communities came out for this game. An incredibly festive, fun evening, at the USA football venue. They just completely took it over.
It doesn't change. It doesn't go away.
Yeah.
That kind of, that connection back to your country of origin, and that's the great thing about the game. Great thing about football.
And absolutely felt that, just being there. And so just back to your story then. You're here in Massachusetts and you're playing in that league, but you're also transitioning a bit into a professional career in the game or in sport. So what else were you doing while you were here in Massachusetts?
Well, after college, like I said, I tried a little bit with professional football, but it wasn't for me, particularly the indoor game. And so we're just sitting around with some of our friends, and you're running out of money, and rent has to be paid. So we started a company called the Soccer Network to just bring our kind of love of the game and minimal coaching knowledge, but definitely a love of the game and an ability in the game, and created a company that would do camps and clinics and work with local clubs. And we just got going, and we had more or less enough work to pay the rent. And that's how we sort of transitioned into working with kids. It was kind of my, I'd done a little while I was in college at a summer camp and these things, but kind of taking a bit of responsibility of well, how are we going to coach? What's our thing? What's our curriculum? What's what are we teaching? And that was really, really good. We got a really good response in Cambridge, where the university was. So we had the Harvard fields to do camps, and we developed a program there. And I think that's where I probably met Dean Conway for Jamaica Plain. And I think we did a couple of things out there at a camp, and we just connected with the youth scene, the growing youth scene. This is early 80s, outside of the ethnic population, the American Italians, the American Portuguese. So that's what we did.
I mean, this was the era when youth soccer certainly was moving into the wider suburban America. I grew up in Northern Virginia. This was, I started playing late 70s, early 80s, and it was everybody just signed their kid up for soccer. No one knew how to coach it because none of the parents had played soccer growing up, but it was very much a moment. And, I think Massachusetts was one of the youth hotbeds of youth soccer in a similar way that the Washington, D.C. area was. And I think in retrospect, probably because of the immigrant populations that were there, and there was some knowledge of the game already.
Yeah. So the game was booming. So we did that for a few years, and
so this was the first time you're actually coaching kids on the field. Is that fair to say?
Yes. So I was working with a good friend of mine, Doug Tajan. So he had the USSFA license, so he was the license coach. And I think for my part, I love working with kids, and I love being around them. So at the camps, we had a lot of fun. So our logo on the back of our shirts was a picture of a field, different position, was "Soccer is fun," and that was it. That captured. We tried to come up with the slogan, but I said that's what it is, and that was our kind of brand, if you like, to say, we want kids to come, particularly young kids, and catch the bug of the game and love it.
And so how were you? This is the first time you're coaching, but what were you doing to sort of build your skill and knowledge as a coach? How intentional were you about it? And did you at that time think, oh yeah, I really enjoy this, and this is where I want to build a career and in the game?
Yeah, I don't. In terms of building a career, I don't think it was structured. I wanted to stay in the game. That's for sure. I was playing, and I had time, and I wanted that time to be something to do with sport or kids or football. I think that was pretty strong. That was pretty clear. That's what I wanted to do. So, but it wasn't something that just. I don't think I had a plan. We took direction from the federation and from, kind of the structure around coaching. But it's very different in those days compared to what it is to today, Plus, we didn't have the internet. We just had the internet, only just. And to just be able to go on YouTube and see all kinds of examples, drills, games, technique and everything like that. But I think it was more just coaching out of our own heart, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
And we felt that was enough. I think when we went out to coach some high school teams, I think we could have done with a bit more structure. I'll admit it. I think you have to have some structure behind it. You can't just be an ex-player who loves the game and go out and sort of osmosis to the kids. Some kind of structure does help. So I think we built that very gradually over time.
Yeah. Were you aware at all of what was happening in Europe in terms of youth football development, or were you pretty isolated?
No, we were US focused. In those days, again, the connection, is phone calls back home kind of thing. So things were more localized. But we did some work with the Massachusetts Youth Soccer Association, and going to their convention and picking up things there. I think I can remember one of those conventions. The one thing I remember is we were doing demonstration from Soccer Network about what we do, and here's some activity, and we're doing 1v1. And so there was one young player who was doing a demo, and I was out there being the defender. I said, okay, we're going to teach the steps of 1v1. And so this is a young player who just couldn't get it. They sort of, I guess they picked a player, but we're trying to do the 1v1 to demonstrate, and you go this way and then this way, and then you got to shift the weight of the defender. So we're trying to do that, and the kid couldn't do it, and he's kind of looking at their watch, and I just stuck with it. I took the extra 5 minutes. Okay, let's stop. Let's do. This is the motion. Okay, just do that a few times, and then we built it up, and then finally, luckily, they kind of drilled down and do a step over and by and shoot, and everybody was like really behind the player, and somebody came up to me afterwards and said, "My God, you have patience," and I said, "Yes." Because that's what that player needed, And so it was very much, learning about, kids are different. Every kid's different, and just looking at what each kid needs and trying to find the time and the patience to help them in some way to grow.
So, I've coached a fair amount. More recently, it's been with the U10s. I don't know what age group this was, but you see a lot of kids at that age, they haven't played a lot of soccer, many of them at that point. Some have, but a lot haven't. And without a doubt, every season, there is at least one of those moments that I have on the field with a kid. And I, don't want to be over sentimental about it, but it really does. Those are the moments that, for me, remind me of why I enjoy coaching, when you have that breakthrough with the kid. You mentioned patience. I mean, patience really does pay off, especially at that age. Again, I work with a lot of U10s, but you'll see kids, coming into a season and they're nowhere. And then when you get those little connections throughout the season where you see a little bit of skill development, and then the development is anything but linear, and you see these spurts of development sometimes with these kids, and then you see the joy and the satisfaction they have of developing their own skill set. And without a doubt, you have those moments, and the patience really does pay off, particularly I think at those younger ages.
Yeah. And there's that diversity of young kids that we had coming through the program of all levels. And you met their parents, and their parents don't care what level it. They want you to help them develop. That's your job. You're a coach. That's what you do. So, but it has to be for everybody. I learned that early, I think.
And everything back then, I'd say, was, we call it grassroots soccer now, but this was really before there was the club system like we have here in the U.S., right? These were not parents paying the equivalent of $3,500 a year for their kids to play. This was grassroots football here, right?
Very much. Yeah, that's why probably we didn't succeed as a business. We did okay, but we didn't charge those kind of fees. So maybe we loved the game too much. I don't know.
Well, there probably wasn't the same kind of market for it like there is today. Okay, so then you're here in Boston, and maybe let's fast forward, because I know you've got a very interesting career in leadership in sports that did follow. And I asked you the question, were you thinking about building a career? And I realize in retrospect, probably a silly question. A guy in his 20s who's really thinking about building a career at that age. It's only at this stage that we look back and connect all the dots.
Yes.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about, if you can, what came next for you, and kind of the next chapter in your life.
So we're doing the Soccer Network. I did a master's degree in business at Babson on the side, and I graduated there. And then I'm looking for something a bit bigger. I think an organization or something like that. So I got a parent of one of the kids that I was coaching, Tom Dawley, fantastic guy, professional guy, consultant in strategy. He was representing a project in Special Olympics in Washington, D.C., run by Eunice Kennedy and Sarge Schreiber. And so he said, they're looking for a football director, a soccer director, So it was one of those things. I wasn't looking, but somebody's looking, and somebody knows. So he introduced me to the people at Special Olympics in D.C., and I went down there, and I was so blown away by the organization and the people, and particularly Eunice Kennedy and her strength and desire to bring sport to individuals with intellectual disability around the world. I mean, it's amazing vision. And so it was one of these things I just went down to have a look at. And after 10 minutes with her, and then with Sergeant Schreiber, who started the Peace Corps, and he's just showing me the globe and the map and said, you could change so many lives around there. And it's the kind of interview you can't say no, anyway, so they liked my application, and I ended up going down to Washington, D.C., and moving on to the next thing with Special Olympics.
And so how old was that organization at that point?
It'd been around for a while, since the 60s. 68, I think, was the first World Games in Chicago, I think, if I remember rightly. So it'd been around a while. So it was established, and they were trying to go to the next level. And Eunice Kennedy was an enormous sports person. Sarge Schreiber was a global thinker. So it's an interesting combination of the two. But she wanted anybody who had an intellectual disability to have proper coaching. See, that's so important. Not just dress them up and take them out to a competition. Let's make sure that they get the benefit of good coaching. So that was the change in the organization. And they were hiring people in different sports to try and develop that sense of equality of opportunity from the coaching of sport.
What did your job look like day to day?
Every day was different. We sort of made it up as we went along because it was new. So I focused in the U.S. for the start and visiting different states, seeing what they were doing. There had been a part-time director before, Bernie Fagan, who passed away recently, a great friend. He was from Sunderland and played pro football out in in Portland, Oregon, and he was the director. And so we kind of developed some ideas together. And part of it was just getting other organizations on board. I think Special Olympics was quite closed. It was people who went to institutions or in special classes being taught sport, but it was quite closed. And I think my contribution there was to go to the USYSA and say, we should be doing this together. Every youth sport, every youth football, soccer organization should have a special program to bring together kids with and without disability. That's the whole idea here. And so we developed this program called Top Soccer, the outreach program for soccer called Top Soccer. And we went to Chicago, we brought all the different states in, and we started to, how could we develop this? Because if a group of players with an intellectual disability train on their own, it's quite challenging for a coach to actually do much. You put another 10 kids without disability who can support and help and like sport, now you got something going, and that can have a lot of benefits on both sides. That was the concept. It's now called unified sports in Special Olympics. It's bringing people together is the key thing, and it helps develop their abilities and their social side and their communication and everything like that. So that's what we did. Last thing I'll say on that, I went online the other day. I hadn't even looked for years to some side. I put Top Soccer Texas, Top Soccer, and they have Top Soccer everywhere. And
it's still around. That's fantastic.
It's around and it's grown. And you have all the endorsements from parents, what that's meant for their child. And that, I think that's one of the most satisfying things I've ever done, is to be able to do something and then 20, 30 years later look back and it's still there and it's having an impact.
So yeah, and a lot of, I think, how the world, tunes into Special Olympics when they have the big events and but there's a whole another tranche of activity that is happening on the developmental side, and you were very involved in that, it sounds like.
Yeah. And it's the day-to-day stuff, and I mean, you give something. I learned a lot through that, obviously, I stayed with the organization for 20 years, so I picked up a lot. But largely from the athletes themselves, our competitions, just the effort and the joy, the volunteers. It's a volunteer-driven organization. And that's an amazing part of the U.S., I found, was this commitment to volunteerism, and they ran all the events. It's all volunteer. All the coaching is volunteer. And then, the interaction with parents, because parents were very involved. When you have a son or daughter with a disability, that doubles your involvement in many ways. So for them to have people helping them develop their child was enormously important. So there's those things. You get a lot back, and that kind of feeds you, I think. And I think from a coaching perspective, we talked before about patience. And so with a special needs program, you need particular patience, but you get a lot back if you allow that to happen and stay with it.
Yeah, well, this is an interesting, I only sort of recently talked about, I think our last conversation, we touched on this a little bit, and I will certainly include some links to Top Soccer and Special Olympics in the show notes. But you stayed with Special Olympics, but this is when you moved into an even bigger leadership role. And did you move back to Europe at this point as well?
I went via Toronto. So I finished in Washington, then we had the World Winter Games in Toronto. So I went up there for 2.5, 3 years to be a representative for the international side. And so understood how Canadians are different to Americans, and that was really good, really interesting, seeing the difference, not very far over the border. It felt more like Europe,
Is that right?
Yes, it did. Definitely did. And it was incredibly cold. I've never been as cold in my life in Toronto. But again, it's a World Games, fantastic experience. You got 60 countries coming in, and it's all the winter sports. It was a great experience. And then that finished, and then I moved to Brussels to become the CEO of the European network, the European organization. It was Europe and Eurasia, Russia, former Soviet Union. So it was pretty big Europe in those days. Yeah, so we developed the different programs around Europe. That was kind of next step, which is a bit more, as you say, leadership oriented rather than, just grassroots sport. So, But that, again, was a really interesting experience of that.
And I mean, you were in a completely different role, of course, than when you started here in the U.S. with Special Olympics. But, you mentioned the volunteerism and that dimension to it here in the U.S. Just quickly, I'm curious, is there a point of contrast there with what you experienced in Europe? And admittedly, maybe you weren't on the ground as much, kind of seeing it up close, but...
Yeah, I think it varied. I mean, it which country, but in Europe, there's plenty of social capital, if you like, of volunteerism. But there were a lot of professionals coaches who worked in that field. So they're working in a center or something like that. They tend to come more, the government puts more money into it. It's more supported, particularly like the Nordic countries or Germany. And, but still a lot of volunteers the further you go east, it varies, tends to be more institutional. So we spent several trips going around Russia, which is fascinating. We were in that whole region. But there it's very much institutionalized. But sport is such a big thing particularly from the communist, ideology side. Sport's very important. So everybody does sport. And it's about fitness and your mind and your body. And it doesn't matter who you are, that sport's important. So you see very different kind of nuances of how they approached it. But again, I think that what drives it was, let's say in soccer, it was the game and the athletes, the players, they bring that same energy. It doesn't matter where you are. It could be in America in a Portuguese league or in Russia in a Special Olympics program with young people playing. And the game is the game. And I think that's what was always my approach was the game is the game. So it's equal to and equally open. Make it equally open.
Well, say of all the people I know in sports, in football, you have a particularly unique experience just in terms of the different geographies in which you've lived and worked. And I know a lot of people in sports, have that kind of background. But you're an Englishman. You went to school in the U.S. You worked in the U.S. You worked in Toronto, and then back in Europe. And you were working at a very high level in this leadership role. But talk a little bit about your transition out of Special Olympics and kind of what was behind that. Where were you in your life? And then where were you physically? Because I know now you're in Barcelona, but is that where you went after that? Or
yeah,
so
we were in Brussels. And I think I'd done everything I wanted to do, to be honest. I loved the people and loved the challenge, traveling around all the countries, seeing the different cultures, and so it's all fascinating. And we just had our first child, who was 2 or 3 years old. So that was a shift, getting married, having kids. And so I think we're just looking for something different. So as a part of that, we looked at the map of Europe and said, well, we've been in grey, cloudy Brussels for 10 years. And so what could be next? So we looked around the whole Mediterranean coast base. We've got the map of the Mediterranean coast. My wife wanted to go to Turkey. That was on the cards at the time. We almost did, but didn't.
And is she English as well, Mike?
No, she's Belgian, so she was the local connection. So you look at Italy, it's a bit chaotic to go as a foreigner and build something there because it didn't have any there. We're just independents now, looking for the next thing. The French coast Riviera is very expensive. So you go over the Pyrenees and there's Barcelona, and it's one of those things. So it was just doing that and looking where we would like to be, and then we'll figure it out. And then at the same time, I was talking to Coerver Coaching. So Alf Kalustian, one of the co-founders of Coerver Coaching, along with Charlie Cook, a very famous Chelsea player, have this organization that was just developing, was gaining momentum. He had worked with me in Special Olympics. So the Coerver
so that's where you met.
He would come to the World Games to do clinics and everything. He was really into that, trying to figure out that, how to do more ball mastery with our athletes, and make that impact. So they were looking for somebody to help them grow their network. So that sounded good. Also, I could be remote. And so that's what we decided on Barcelona. And then we're actually living just south of Barcelona near a place called Sitges. We went there because we had a growing family. We had a second child, and the environment, the weather, the family friendliness of the Spanish culture, everything seemed to fit. And we said, let's give it a year, as you do.
And a year has become
well, they do, particularly when you have kids and they get into school and you start making some friends. So we've been here 12, 13 years now ever since. So plus the football is amazing. Barcelona was one of the most famous teams. And so the football culture here was also very big on a local level.
So if I'm getting my dates correct, you moved there probably during the Guardiola Renaissance.
Yeah,
Is
so
that right? Or just
it would be Guardiola was a player, and then Guardiola became the coach. Yeah. So during those times, before he went to Man City and all that. So those early days, but it was the era of Barcelona with Iniesta and Messi and many other players.
great
So
time
it
to
was a
be there, of course.
different level of football hit the world, So yeah, so that became the influence, and with the Coerver part, they're very much grounded in that revolution of football that came from Holland, came from Johan Cruyff, went to Barcelona, was picked up by Guardiola. Guardiola takes it to Man City, etc. And that kind of skillful new modern game was what we were surrounded with. So that was good too,
Yeah, well, talk a little bit if you can about Coerver, and maybe Alf Galustian and Charlie Cook as well. But the name Coerver, it's Viel Coerver, right? A Dutch coach, correct?
Yes, he was a coach, very very top level pro coach. Had a heart attack, got out of the pro game, then needed, he's a very analytical kind of coach, and he wanted to figure out what made great players great. And he started analyzing that and creating a method, a simple method around ball mastery, the importance of ball mastery, the importance of the modern game having every player being highly skillful, which was a new concept. And then that was kind of the total football of the Dutch team in the 80s. Incredibly skillful, positions intermixing everywhere. It was a new way to look at the game. Alf Galustian and Charlie Cook. Charlie was one of the great Chelsea players, got together and acquired the rights to that methodology. And then since then, for 40 years, grew that all over the world as kind of the number one way for kids to learn high level of skill, of course, skills. And so they just celebrated the 40th anniversary.
Yeah, congratulations.
Organization. We went to Adidas headquarters in Herzog, amazing trip. And Adidas have been a sponsor for 30 some years. So this organization that kind of laser focused on the technical side of the game in the bigger context of playing the game. So I joined them, and so I now coordinate licensees in Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. And so there we look for kind of like-minded coaches who want to bring this kind of methodology and teaching to the players and promote that, and continues to grow, around the world.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously the Dutch influence on world football is very much outsized considering its size as a country, but it's certainly exported more than a few ideas in the world of football. So this has been your job. You're working internationally, and you're working with a lot of these coaches now in different parts of the world, as you mentioned. I'm curious kind of how you have experienced that in terms of differences or similarities from country to country and what you're seeing. I mean, these are coaches who are coming to Coerver, so on some level they're probably very bought into this methodology or this approach to football. But how do you see some of these things play out on the ground with these coaches in different parts of the world?
Yeah, it does play out. That's what you learn. For sure. With the Coerver methodology, it's a pretty set methodology. This is what it drills games, this principles. It's what they brought to the game, a structure, or the coaches could learn. Not a complicated structure, but one that's fairly clearly defined. But yeah, you learn, and I think I learned that because I traveled a lot before anyway, that how you communicate that is going to be different in different countries. Football culture is a reflection of the culture, the bigger culture, the way the Latin, we have a new program in Argentina, and what the game is there, the depth of the game, and the way kids absorb this to a very deep level of how to play and what they see, and the Argentinian teams and the big players, highly competitive, kind of driven more from the poorer aspect of growing up in tough neighborhoods. There's a toughness to the game there that you don't see so much in the Nordic game. It's fairly affluent countries committed to education and growth and development and equality of girls and boys and women and men, and it's very different. But so every time we set up a licensee, there are differences, and the way they approach things, some will be more focused on the structure. Some will not really want any structure at all. They want a few principles, and then it's a more emotional game, like in Latin America. So But I think the thing about the Coerver methodology, they've developed it so it's flexible. It can be adopted by different cultures. But the kind of the big experiment from Coerver was in Japan. So Alf Galustian, 30 some years ago, went to Japan where football didn't really exist. The J League was just starting, and developed a relationship with the federation, who wanted to see the rise on a national level of football, with the end result being they wanted top national teams that were respected and have some pride in that. So it was interesting, Alf tells a lot of stories about working in Japan, which is, completely different culture. But what they do have is this patience and this iterative approach of how to develop. And it's long-term, step by step. This could take 30 years. That's okay. And they're also highly disciplined. And so when players come to the field, they listen to everything that the coach says. That's how it is, And the coaches, if you're teaching coaches, when Alf walks in the room, will stand up and, and they have this learning culture and respect and discipline, which in a sense makes it easy to teach in one way. But what Alf said they have to try and bring in was more the Charlie Cook part of the business. He was an ex-player, highly skillful, highly emotional. He's the emotion behind the methodology. And he said, that's what we need to bring into that fighting spirit into the Japanese game. So you need both. And I think now when you look at the Japanese national teams, men and women, they're, basically top 10 in the world or top 15 in the world.
Yeah, Japan, similar to the U.S., was really nowhere on the international scene, and I think they certainly put forward respectable teams on the men's side, and then they won the tournament on the women's side, of course, which was a remarkable tournament, and actually, frankly, a tournament run that was fueled very much by a lot of emotion after the earthquake and the tsunami.
Yes, that's right.
In Japan, that was one of the most remarkable sporting events and runs by a team that I think I saw. But yeah, so the women's game certainly has developed
huge.
Immensely.
Huge. So that involvement in the women's game for Coerver was long time standing in the US. Global representative in the Coerver girls side is Christine Lilly, one of the greatest players of all time. But she grew up as a Coerver kid, if you like, mostly with boys. Girls football didn't really exist. But somebody like that who went on to an amazing career will always explain why having those core skills was so important to her and how it set her one step above and how it helped to deal with the pressure of the growingly competitive game at the international level. You still had to fall back on that ability for first touch, the ability for 1v1, the ability to see space, those kind of core basic principles.
So how do you maybe talk a little bit about the Coerver principles, which are very, very technical, very individual ball mastery oriented, but then also this idea of small-sided games as a development tool within, the youth system. Not that these things have to be an either or, certainly, but in relation to one another, how do you experience that? And how does Coerver also talk about small-sided games in their methodology?
Yes, because you can cover... The original Coerver was very much based on repetition, ball mastery. The more time you spend with the ball and teach your brain rather than your feet how to control and move the ball and manipulate the ball, that was that. And so that was kind of the mark of Coerver. But it's been 40 years because you have two co-founders who are endlessly curious about and how can we do this better. So they've evolved as the game has evolved. So ball mastery is still a foundation, but on top of that, you build 1v1, you build combinations, you build small group play. A lot of the practice in Coerver is in small groups, 2v2, 3v3, et cetera, et cetera. Because, and I would agree with the people who say, small-sided play with conditions or constraints is a fantastic teacher. That's become for years, an integral part of the Coerver method. So you have foundation skills, you have combinations, how you combine in small groups, and then you have the more open, small-sided game. How do you bring that into a game? So I think there's been an evolution there. So it's come a long way from the work of Viel Coerver, who is very much 99% individual repetition to fit but the game has changed too, the demands of the game. I think Coerver's changed along with that. So I don't think it is an either or. I think both are useful, but if you don't have the core skills of being that ball feeling, that ability to receive the ball, move with the ball, see space, the core things to pass, to shoot, the technical side of that, if you don't have that, then as the game gets less space, more pressure, you fall back on those skills in an intuitive way.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if you just do lots of repetition at training and that's it, then you're definitely taking away a big part of the game that will then show up. The lack of creativity, the lack of joy in the game, you'll see that. So I think it's an evolution, yes.
Are you familiar with, in the U.S., the model recently that's been put forward in the youth game from U.S. soccer has been this play, practice, play model. Are you familiar with that at all? Or is that
No, tell me. But no,
okay.
So play, practice, play sounds, yeah.
Yeah,
You
so fundamentally...
you start with the game and then you do some practice and then you finish with the game.
Exactly. And so part of it is actually very practical at the youth level because you kind of get these small games going at the beginning of a practice. And as it is like here in Jamaica Plain in Boston, Jamaica Plain youth soccer, kids kind of filter in over the course of, 10 or 15 minutes. And so it's really helpful just to have these small games going. A coach can be playing. And but you're fundamentally doing, small games, 3v3, 4v4, 2v2, even, the first few kids show up and then you just grow it. And then the middle part of the practice is the practice piece. And that's where you tend to do what I would, again, to oversimplify it, a little bit more of like the Coerver type of activity that's more around ball mastery, more, each player has a ball. They're doing these kind of practice activities to build skills. The kind of the hard wiring stuff is what I call it. Yes. And then it's back at the end of the practice to then another small-sided game.
Yes.
And so it takes those two models and puts it into a framework for a practice. I found it very useful. It's only the last few years that we've really started to adopt it more, but it does speak, I think, to those two aspects of development, the Coerver method, the hard wiring, the developing the skills, but then the in-game decision-making, the constraints that you can put on that. And it seems that's a lot of where the game is going on the youth development side.
Yes, and it sounds fun. I think that there are many ways to coach. There are many ways to implement. I think if on principle, players need to spend plenty of time with the ball and learn moves, learn to teach the body how to manipulate the ball and embed that very deeply. And then, but you have to play. You have to play as much as possible as well. So if you do both, I like the idea. That's the play, practice, play. The practice is important. I mean, I think that's one thing, being around the Coerver program for years and seeing it work, being out in 20, 30 countries and going, my God, these players are good. And seeing where they pick up this sense of the ball and the control of it, and being able to then spend time finding space rather than messing with the ball. I mean, these things, it works, but I'm all for the idea that then you have to put it into
the game.
Got to mean something in the game. But practice is key. You got to practice. You have to practice.
Do you see the Coerver methodology more effective at certain ages than others? And I don't want to ask that question.
It's more for young. I think it started off more 6 to 12.
Okay.
And over the last 5 years, they've evolved more into small. It's more the small-sided game approach, that the next fight into the team and what's needed there. So now I would say it's kind of 6 to 16. It's not the professional game. Although some of our coaches work with professional players, because, the individual touch on the ball, you have to keep that sharp. And some, top players still need to learn a move. That's just the way it is. There's many ways to coach. And I think, as Alf Galusian taught me, he says, in the end, you coach what you believe. There's lots of sources. Take it in, look at your team, feel good with the way you're coaching, and look to the players and see how that's adding to the players' game, and be honest. Is the way you're coaching adding to their game?
Yeah. So, Mike, you've done a lot of work, of course, with Coerver, as we just talked about, but it's not all that you're doing in football. Big Idea Sports. Maybe talk a little bit about that endeavor.
Yeah. So, Big Idea Sports was a concept again with a few football friends of. Besides doing the Coerver work, we wanted a space where we could look at innovation and look at the youth game, or what's the youth game need, to move onto a level that is more inclusive and is better for kids. So that was our goal. How can we make the game better for kids? And Coerver Project is one way to do that. So we started looking at technology and how that might help, because a lot of technology coming into the professional game, some of it's trickling down into the youth game for good and bad. And we started to just ask, what does the game need? And it doesn't take much, to go to a game, whether it be in America or in England or Spain or whatever. And game day it can be pretty brutal still, kind of the atmosphere, the pressure, the parents kind of mimicking the Barcelona fans against Madrid, that bringing that intensity into it that is a bit over the top. And we're thinking, this doesn't help, and this is not helping the game. And kids drop out early, and the coaches are really becoming, directive coaches from the sideline. Well,
and you're seeing that in
from the parents and everything. Yeah. Plus, they model themselves, just like the kids model themselves on watching Messi and wanting to do that. The coaches watch Guardiola or Xabi or whoever on the sidelines, like this, not understanding that's just part of the professional game.
As much as I love Guardiola as a good example as a manager, I never, ever recommend to any coach that we work with here in the grassroots level to behave as he does on the touchline.
I don't think Guardiola would either, so
I'm not sure what good he's even doing. These players, they know.
No, it's part of...
But he's very involved in the game often.
Part of the pressure too on coaches where, if you lose 4 or 5 games in a row in the Premier League, that means something. If you do that in a youth sports, it should not mean very much.
It should not mean something.
And it just means, well, we've got to keep going. It's a totally different arena. So we're trying to think, what can we do? And we focused more in on how do you help coaches? How do you help coaches get better? There's a lot of material, lack of material, drills, games, everything out there. There's plenty of that already. Don't need to go there. But this thing of how do you help coaches work on and improve and be more connected to the players that they're coaching? Because that when a player goes out in the field every Sunday, that's a tough walk. It's a challenging situation, both physically, mentally, socially. Being on a youth team is not the easiest thing, particularly in the environment of lots of parents around and whatever. And the coach is that grounding point for a lot of players and needs to be, to understand this is not just a walk in the woods. This is players put a lot of importance on how they play and how they do. And so the role of the coach, what is the role of the coach? So we started looking into that, and how a coach can help those players navigate the game, navigate the atmosphere, and how you can connect that to the training that they do and how you can communicate better. So it really came down to helping coaches communicate good, positive, useful feedback to their players on a regular basis. And we looked into that, and we found that most coaches do feedback in a very general way. In the team, how did we do? The defense was a bit open, or, we created some good stuff, just didn't finish. This kind of general approach, where most individual kids couldn't care less about that. I mean, they listen, whatever. What kids care about is how they did during the game. What parents care about is how their kid did during the game. So we decided to develop a tool to help coaches observe a game in a way, more individual way, of how's that player doing? How's Alf doing in a particular skill or in his team spirit?
He's still working on his first touch, to answer the question for you.
Well, then that would come up. But then, so what do we do? But so we developed we've developed the version 1 of an application, simple application for coaches, particularly for beginner coaches, to learn how to look at the game from a developmental point of view, and then how to see the game from an observer point of view, to step back and not get overly involved in the emotion of the crowd and the score and everything. But how are our players doing? And not as a group, how's Alf doing? How's Mike doing? How's Gene doing? And being able to capture those thoughts and then transforming those into useful feedback. And so we've created an application to do that called Match Fives, and we're testing it. And, if you go to the Big Idea Sport website, you can see a bit of information on it. If there are coaches out there who want to try it with their teams, we're into the testing phase. We'd love to try it out with anybody. But we really, from the testing we've done, the feedback has been, it actually just helps you step back from the emotion of the game and be more of a, what value can I add to this? The fact is, a coach can't add any value during the game. Very little during the game. The value is in taking observation point of view and think, how are we doing? How are we playing? What are we doing well? And particularly from an individual, start off with that. What are we doing well? So Alf, what did you do well? Okay, now let's have a talk about what could be the next level. So we developed this tool, and it's around well done, what's next approach from coaches on an individual level throughout the season, and involving parents in that discussion so they understand why we're doing this. The coach actually cares about my kid and is trying to help them develop as an individual, the I-in team, I guess you would call it.
But, tech has always been a part of sport, but certainly technology has evolved exponentially just in the last, 5-6 years. And of course, we see it in the professional game. And it's inevitable that we'll be looking for applications for the tech at the youth level.
It's inevitable.
And it feels to me, and I'd be curious to get your perspective on this, but we're at a moment where we have access to a lot of tech, but we're not really sure how to incorporate it into youth sports and development more broadly. And I always, on a personal level, enjoy or kind of look to tech that enables improved reflection and kind of assist a bit in maybe perceiving the things that I might be missing. But I kind of, you work in this space, what are you seeing in terms of trends around tech adoption in the world of football or youth sports generally?
As you say, it tends to trickle down from the professional game. So tech is used hugely in the professional game. So there's this pressure that if you're serious football club, it could be 7-year-olds or 8-year-olds, but if you're serious, you will look to that technology and put tracking devices in their boots and do heat mapping and all this kind of stuff. But you and I know, and most people know that, there's a positive kind of better future side of tech, and there's a dark side to tech in everything, social media, everything, right? But that includes anything that comes from the professional game that is being offered to the youth game. You have to take that look, and it's the role, the responsibility, particularly of the coach, to really look into that carefully. Just because it's used by Barcelona FC doesn't mean it's going to fit your local youth team. So you have to have some criteria. You've got to look at it. In the pros of tech, it helps with club management, training ideas, injury tracking, nutrition, VAR, yes or no, not bad, but we're not using it very well. But there's a positive side to most things in tech, right? I mean, there is. But the negative, I think, on a media side, there's too much tech, there's too much media tech. Football is becoming diluted and just a tsunami of football. And then people start to lose interest in a way in the nuance of the game. Sports journalism, you see data coming into sports journalism, which kills the game.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone now looks at the rankings of this player was 7.74 and the other player was 6.8, as if that means something. But that's starting to creep into that. Over-analysis is starting to creep into the game. I don't know if you see that, but...
Oh, I absolutely see it. I mean, kids, my son, plays EA Sports FIFA. Probably won't put that in the show notes, but, every player is quantified on these different, skill set that they have. And it resolves all up to a certain number. This player is an 84, right? And, this is one of the questions that I had for you. You've been working in sports and youth sports for a long time now, and you've seen more tech come into the game, but and also just touching on what we talked about earlier, like seeing football in these different cultures, these different geographies. You talk about individuals playing the game, expressing their skill and their personality in the game, and there's, I think tech maybe takes us a bit away from that potentially. I don't want to oversimplify, of course, but why to you is personal expression in sport so important?
I think that's because that's one of the rare opportunities in a way I think the sport gives you, because of sport in itself is kind of a a demarcation of a almost sacred, space where individuals can go into that is separate from the outside things we have to do and everything. There's a very kind of special place where you can play. It's a place of play. And it's a place, play along with play goes self-expression. Young kids know this very well. They carve out some little area and they play very seriously. So no, it's not that play's not serious, but it's creative. And I think that's what sport and football can be. It's its own space. And what that brings with it the opportunity of freedom. I think kids these days don't have a lot of freedom, funnily enough. There's all kinds of stuff they have, and they enjoy, but I don't think they have that sense of freedom. I talk about that just because that was our experience. Maybe we just don't get it, but our experience was in the game, you give it everything, but you give it in a way that gives you a sense of freedom. And I was a player that always just wanted to play and just play. And you don't want a coach, yelling at you. You just play with your friends and your teammates and you make it work. And the game is designed to bring that out, that kind of creativity and freedom. But it's just a porous game from influence from outside. It's not a box that is kind of titanium covered that keeps all the influence out. But and I think that's what guides me is that's at the best times. That's what I experience through my sport. And that is unique. And it also helps your spirit and who you are in a very deep way that is not calculated or measurable. Mm-hmm. And tech is calculated and measurable in general.
And I think it does. Tech does force us or encourage us into that space of the quantitative. But there is, if I could agree with you more on this point, I would. Sport does provide this sacred space. And some of my earliest memories were just, I grew up in the suburbs of Northern Virginia. We lived on a cul-de-sac, right? This is the kind of planned suburban community. Yes. So it's a road that just ends in a circle. Yeah. And around that were a few houses, and each house had a driveway. And so we created a space within that circle. I played on asphalt with a family. There were 3 boys up the street. They were all older, but they were all soccer players. And my brothers and I would play with them, multiple ages. And we created this space. And one driveway on one side was a goal and the other on the other side was another goal. And, it's easy to talk about these things. Part of it's nostalgia for your own childhood and the like. But, that was very much a part of my experience growing up and learning the game. And I learned a lot there in that circle. So, I agree with you. I think we do need to really scrutinize. I'm not the one being interviewed here, but I'll put forward, my idea on this. I think we really need to scrutinize how we adopt tech.
Yes,
in the sport specifically, and how we adopt and how adults are involved.
And I think you just can't you can't be naive. And as a coach, or if you're running a sports program, and there's a lot of that, just letting it happen because it's the trend, and it's always look at the pros, and I think that our approach is the kids look at the pros and they get inspired by it, and good. Now let's take the pros out of it, and let's develop a good program for kids. That's what you're about. And the good program for the kids game, which is not the pro game. But the pro game can have enormously positive influence. But in technology, it's interesting. I was watching, there's a new program on Netflix about the Saudi league, the Saudi professional league, with Ronaldo, Benzema, and these people, and how that's shaping football and the next generation. So it's very interesting. There was one of the coaches, foreign coach, German coach, with a top player, and they're doing their post-game kind of analysis, post-game catch-up, right? And this is professional, right? So he's talking about the game, and the player had a good game, and he's just talking like you and me about the game and this and this and this. And then he sort of swivels his computer over, goes, so let's have a look at the stats, And then both of them, their tone drops, the emotion drops, their interest drops, and the player just kind of looks, has no impact whatsoever, because we've already done it. We've already talked about the game, and to know, well, you ran 2 kilometers more than the last game. I'm not sure if that's good or bad, but but it's I can see it. There's a point and there are marginal gains in the program tactically and technically maybe that tech can bring. That there's no doubt, right?
Sure,
and it's a game
sure.
of tight margins. But I don't think ultimately that's going to make the difference with the top players and the way the game changes. In the youth game, it has no application, personally, I think. And you'll get that same reaction. Kids might look at, something interesting, but it won't improve the game. And it shifts them more into the video game world. And I think we're trying to shift them away from as a other side of the video game world is that game. But anyway, as we got into developing Match 5, so we tried to ask these questions. How can you develop something that is just good, human-centered, spirit-building, good for coaches, good for parents? And it's not easy when you start then creating something to
sure. And the impulse in many ways drives you or takes you towards complexity. And one of the things I love to say about football is that it's a simple game.
It's a simple game. Yeah.
And
anyway, in the end, we just said no tracking. So no visual tracking, no rankings, no player boards, no microanalysis. Those are our 4 principles that we try to stick to when we design this platform for coaches and players and parents. Yeah.
Yeah. Brilliant. Love it. Well, this is a great I got a couple more questions for you, Mike. And I think this is actually a good segue into the next one is you talk about coaches in the youth game, and you've seen a lot in your career for sure. But if I'm a coach, I've got a 7-year-old, 8-year-old who's just starting to play, and I want to get involved and coach her team. Where do you start as a coach? And do you start with scouring the internet for practice plans? Do you start with getting kind of some core principles? What advice do you have for new coaches?
Yeah, there's a lot, and I think reading the blog that you put out, because it's been your background, it is important to first, I agree, look at what's your coaching principles. Why are you doing this? Why are we doing youth soccer? What are we looking for? What's the outcome? What's a winning season? What does that look like? What does that mean? These are very important, I think, first questions before you get to the how am I going to coach? It's the why am I coaching? And why are we doing this? Because it's taken for granted, because it's good for kids. Being on a sports team is good for kids. Well, that depends on many things.
That's right. And we hope it is.
We hope unbelievably good. And when it's well done, there's nothing like it, right? What it builds, for life. But I think it is that asking those 2 questions. Then you're looking for material. I'm biased because I've worked with Coerver for a long time. I would say take a look at it, because there's a lot of really good material.
I would absolutely agree with that.
Courses, the intro course, a youth diploma, but go to the Federation. The Federation have growingly good material. I think you have to say they're improving. They're looking at the wider picture of why are we doing this? How can you design a session that's good for kids? So I think there's a lot more available. It's just for the beginner coach, I think it can be overwhelming. Just, the 3 pieces of advice, as you said, keep it simple. You don't need 50 drills, and you don't need 25 more, the Barcelona FC Academy. You don't need that. You need your core 10, basic structure. But for the youngest players, it'll be more how you coach them, your attitude to them, how you make every player feel relaxed and recognized, and give them a perspective on everything that goes wrong during the game.
Yeah.
There's more that doesn't quite go right than goes right.
That's right.
And you've got to love that.
That's right. The game has plenty of failure for everyone in it. That's part of the beauty.
I don't even call
it
right? failure. I mean, you can't call it failure in the technical sense. As they get older, come on, we can improve on that one for sure. For the younger ones, I don't think that matters. It's all they're out playing the game, going on the field, mimicking the pros they watch on TV, and the game takes over, and that's enough. But practice-wise, you can help them develop their confidence by giving them plenty of time on the ball, technical skills. You can do that, and that will be seen. They'll be more confident on the field. And if things are not going well, you just got to be there for them in a personal way. So make it, you got to be positive, but you got to be personal. You can't be coaching the pro game. You can't be doing that. You're coaching the kids, what's in front of you, but nothing new in that, I suppose. And I guess the last one, this comes from the Coerver, philosophy too is because practice is really important. I think in a different way, kids can learn more from the practice sessions than the game. I think the game has its own dynamic, and it teaches resilience, when you're down, and many good things, and something's on the line. Putting you got skin in the game here. That's life. You got to do that. But training itself is preparing for that. So in the Coerver way is that the game day for young players is just an extension of practice. It's an extension of development. Whether you win 2-1 or lose 2-1 is of little importance. Really.
Yeah. So thinking of those games as developmental opportunities as much as they are competitive ones.
Yeah, but it's a slightly high level of competition, but that's okay. But still, how are we doing? Are we developing? Well, that's the question, and just reflecting, as you said, reflecting on that. So, but I think for a beginner coach, it can be daunting. You know that better than I do. But there's plenty of information out there. But just take it step by step, and
and keep it simple. I think that's great. That's great advice. Just generally,
love being with
the
kids. But try to improve them if you can. Yeah. But in the game, don't say a thing except well done. Don't say anything else.
Love it. Yeah. Well, great. So, Mike, really appreciate your time. I've got one last question for you. I always ask this. Any resources, any particular things that you return to in your coaching or thinking about the youth game, anything you can share with some of our listeners?
Yeah. So you asked me to look at that. And so I'm like you, an avid reader of the game and anything around it, or leadership or coaching, so you take your sources from all over the place, particularly on the internet now. There's so much. But book-wise, I still read books. People listening still read books, but hopefully some of them do. And it is important to read books. So there's a very famous book from a scientist, if you like, from the past, called Desmond Morris. He wrote The Naked Ape, very famous book. So he wrote a book called The Soccer Tribe. And this book is I think it's been republished now, because it went out. And but I read it when I was 20 years old. It's called The Soccer Tribe. And it is this tribute to the depth of the game, all the way back to our ancestors, why we have this urge to play and compete and set up games. So it's a bit about the history of the game from a point of view of the humankind, the way humans think, but it has all the history of the game. So if you enter the game as a coach, I think it gives that scope of how big and deep this game is. And I think for a beginner coach too, it's there. Don't worry. Once you get a ball and a field and 2 goals, a lot of this just takes over. You know, and because it has been doing that since, I know, they invented something round to kick. So that's a great book, Soccer Tribe it's not a coaching book. So I thought I'd choose one that's not. One that's more around leadership, and so coaching, leadership, lessons from coaches, more from the college level or pro level, but more from the college level, I think, by Sally Jenkins, and it's called The Right Call. It's very good.
Right Call.
It's really good at establishing principles for coaching, and it's a good read. She's a great writer. She's a New York Times writer. She's really, it's a pleasure to read, but you come away with some interesting things for your professional life as well as your coaching life. So it's a good one. It's Sally Jenkins, The Right Call.
Sally Jenkins, yeah.
Last one is just on LinkedIn. So I follow a lot on LinkedIn. Once in a while, you find good articles. And there's the manager of football development for the Dutch Federation, Org van der Breggen. I think the Dutch Federation are very forward-thinking. And they ask a lot of questions about what's good for kids, and also how do you develop top players as well? How do you devise the different settings for different kids at different levels? And he's very, very passionate about that part of the game. It also shows what leadership from a federation or an association can do. I think in the US game is more disparate, it's more fragmented structures, but even leadership like you within a club. So it gives some good ideas there. So anyway, those are mine. That's my list.
That's great, Mike. Thank you. I'll put all of those in the show notes. So for folks who can look at that later, have links to those things. And, I'll just say also, you mentioned LinkedIn. I've been surprised myself in these last few months as I've been organizing my own kind of professional and career life, LinkedIn has been an incredible resource. There's a lot of people who are actually, publishing some content on that platform. It's a great way to connect and network with people.
Yeah,
working in the game all around the world as well. I certainly, you and I connect there on occasion, and there's just a lot of great content, and it's a great place to start.
There's a good community on there, and lots of different points of view. So it's a good one.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Mike, I always love when we chat. This is the first one we've recorded, and I just looked at the clock, and we've gone over 90 minutes. We're in stoppage time now.
Yeah, I can't stop talking, so I'm sorry about that.
Hey, it's a podcast. That's exactly what we're here to do. It's always great talking to you, and I appreciate your time and just being on the podcast here. And we'll definitely get the show notes out for everyone to see. And you can come to Coach Craft Podcast to find that info. Yeah. But yeah, Mike, again, thank you.
You're really welcome. I wish you luck with your project, and I see how it's starting to take shape. With your blog and the podcast, and I think there's a space for it because there's a lot of stuff out there on sport and football. But the youth coach approach is to do it intelligently and with some really good intent. I think there is a space for that. I see it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate you saying that. And hey, this is fun. Getting to I think just have these conversations. That's a lot of what coaching is about: is knowledge sharing, making connections, building relationships. And, there's just a lot of really, really smart people out there, dedicated
different
people who are working in the game. Yeah. And you can never have enough perspective. And, I think we all got a lot today. So again, Mike, thank you. And
you're welcome. Thank you for that, Yeah.